Okay, it looks like we're live.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, Adam. Good morning, everyone. Thanks all for being here. Great to see you guys as always. We'll go ahead and dive right into our meeting today. So the agenda for today, we are going to start with an approval of meeting minutes from our meeting number 4, as we usually do. And then we added a new agenda item that was not on the agenda that we sent out. Ron brought to our attention just a moment ago. And that is going to be an update on the legislation to change the board schedule. And we'll dive into all of that detail here in a moment. But just to give you guys an update on a piece of legislation that CEO worked on to help give us a little bit more time for this code development process. Next, we'll move into a small schedule update for the board and an exciting update that accompanies the reason we are changing the schedule. So I won't give away the good news until we get there, but we'll spend about 10 minutes talking about that and then make sure you guys don't have any questions and that any schedule shifts seem like they work for you guys. Then we'll move on to giving an update for you guys on the webinar and our hope that you all can support the outreach for that webinar. So we've built out a really exciting energy code board toolkit to help you guys spread the word about the webinar in the future public engagement sessions. We've got social media posts as well as email drafts in English and Spanish. So we'll kind of go through what's in that toolkit as well as our ask for the board to help us in spreading the word about the public webinar in a couple weeks. Then for the majority of the meeting, we'll pass it over to Anna to go through a selection of Colorado community codes that we think represent a pretty good smattering of different above code approaches that communities have taken across the state. And the purpose of kind of diving into the above code landscapes in Colorado is to bring the board, up to speed on what different communities are considering for code, the approaches they've taken, the structure they've taken within their code to help lend some inspiration to our low carbon code development process. And then at the end of that, we'll close up and talk about our next meeting. So any questions on where we're headed today? Okay, I'm not hearing any. So just quickly, our objectives of the day to make sure that the board understands and it says revised meeting schedule. The meeting schedule hasn't changed much, but just a small revision to our process that we want to share that'll happen between now and June. That you guys understand our approach for the public webinar and your role in reaching out to your networks to get folks to attend that. And then that you guys understand the landscape of above code adoptions throughout Colorado and how that can help inform our code language process. So with that, we will move on to approval of the meeting minutes. So do I have any motions to approve meeting minutes?
So moved.
I'll second.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Ron. All in favor of approving meeting minutes, please say aye.
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 Awesome. Any opposed, please say aye. Okay, meeting minutes from meeting number 4 are approved. Thank you all. So we will get those finalized and posted on CEO's website. So on to our next and new agenda item, an Energy Code Board legislation update. So Adam, for this, I'll just probably just stop sharing because we don't need to share we don't have any slides, and I'll pass it to you.
Sorry, my unmute button was not being friendly. So thanks, Kim, and thanks, Ron, for bringing this up. So essentially, there was a question about some legislation that has been introduced, I think about a week ago, maybe a little more than a week ago, that includes some updates to the Energy Code Board's schedule for the development of the low carbon code. And I think that there's honestly not a ton of information to provide on this. I think just mostly the real impetus behind date changes to extend the timeline for the board to do this work was due to the delays that we have experienced with the release of the 2024 IECC and the fact that when this legislation and these timelines were originally contemplated, I think most folks were expecting the 2024 several months ago. And obviously we are now basically in May and still don't have a final code from the ICC. And so we at the Energy Office were starting to get pretty concerned about our ability to complete the process in the statutory timelines that were given. And sorry, I'm getting a little bit of a notification that my internet's struggling. So if I break up, let me know. But essentially that is the reasoning behind this, is so that it essentially provides us more time with the code as we know it. And it will also give us just some additional time. Essentially what the original schedule had been gave us a lot of back end time between when the executive committee would have to act on anything and when the final code would have to be published. And so we've also compressed that final time a little bit, just because we did not think it was necessary to have 2.5 months between when the executive committee had to complete any actions and when the board had, or when the Energy Office had to publish the final code. And so we have proposed what is currently in that legislation is to update the dates for completion of the code. So it would move the final date required for publishing the code from June 1st to September 1st of 2025. And that additional 3 months will give us that additional time we're hoping for to try to get, make sure we have plenty of time to conduct this process. And then we also modified a couple of the interim dates as well. So there was a date by which the full Energy Code Board had to have acted, which was originally in statute February 1st of 2025. We have proposed to extend that to June 1st. And then it had put a date when the executive committee would have had to act if the executive committee has anything to consider. It originally was on by March 15th, 2025, and we've extended that to August 1st of 2025. So again, really the purpose behind that was just to give the board more time, to make sure we had plenty of time to do the robust discussions, as well as, given all the conversations we've had about doing robust public engagement, make sure that we have time for both of those things. And given that the actual requirement that the state would be, or when the mandate goes into effect of when jurisdictions must start adopting this code, still is July 1st of 2026, given that we had 13 months between when originally the code was supposed to be published and that date, we felt that it was still reasonable to extend our timeline and it wouldn't impact the adoptable, that deadline for when adoption is required to begin. So that's a little background on the date changes, and happy to answer any questions.
Adam, there's
go ahead.
Oh, sorry, quickly, there's a question in the chat. What House bill or Senate bill number are we referring to here?
That's a great question, and I will actually have to go look it up. I don't know it off the top of my head, but we can get back to you, Tim.
I can jump in. That's Senate Bill 214.
Thank you, Will.
Sorry,
Ron, go ahead.
I couldn't hear that. Sorry, Will. What number?
Oh, Tim, it was Senate Bill 214.
My question is, other than the date changes, it looked like maybe there was something that was happening with the changes to the executive committee. There was some edits to that section as well. Do you know what that was about?
There shouldn't be any edits to the executive committee. So the other amendments were to essentially reallocate some of the money that had been provided for the broader program to the Energy Office for administration of the Energy Code Board. So that was
Adam, this is David.
Sure.
Sorry, I have my camera off because I'm cooking my lunch. But there was a edit to that section where there was a duplicate language. There was
right.
a D and an E that were the same thing, and they just been repeated, and we just cleaned that up.
So that was the executive committee change, was removing duplicative language. Got it. Okay, that makes sense. Why I was confused, because okay.
There were essentially two paragraphs that basically said exactly the same thing back to back, and we weren't sure what the reasoning for it was, and it didn't actually add anything. And so we were like, well, while we're cleaning up, or while we're changing these dates, we might as well clean up the statute anyway.
Okay, so that's the piece that I think confused me the most. So okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah. Andrew?
There appears to also be an edit that opens up the ability of the board to consider other references beyond the code itself. What is the purpose of that and why?
Yeah, so I think you're referring to the and resources
Yes.
language. Is that right, Andrew? Yeah. So as we had discussed, maybe a couple, 3 meetings ago, the ICC, in consideration of the 2024, the ICC board removed some of the provisions that were originally in appendices in the draft 2024 IECC to resources. And so those resources were no longer able to be considered by the board under the statutory language as was originally there. And there was some interest in allowing the board to consider using language in some of those resources because they had been essentially considered appendices throughout the entire process. And so I think the point was to just make sure that those could still be considered. Obviously, those will be determined by the board as to what would be considered or what would be discussed, but it would just essentially re-expand it to cover all of those additional language opportunities that the board had before the ICC board made its decision.
Yeah, and today may not be the time. It might be worth looking at those resources that if ICC, through the consensus standard, deem them, I hate to say the word not applicable, but no longer an appendix for whatever reason with respect to any one resource, could the board be overreaching by potentially seeking to incorporate other resources that it didn't really intend or contemplate?
Sure. And I think, Andrew, I think, one reason why we don't think that this really has any, concern from that perspective is just that, one, it doesn't require the Energy Code Board to do anything. It only allows them to consider additional language, right? And so if the board determines that there is jeopardy there, then the board can decide not to consider any of that language, right? And the other aspect of it is that all of those provisions were appendices throughout the entire code development process. And were approved by the consensus committees, and some of those appeals were rejected by the appeals board. And so I think that there was just, I think that what we have seen is that makes clear that there is not a consensus on whether or not those provisions provide jeopardy or not. And so I think that was part of the reason why it's like, well, why not let the Energy Code Board consider that language? If the board determines that that's not appropriate, then we won't move forward with it. But I think that it just gives the board more options. Tim, did you have a question? Oh, sorry, Andrew, did you have a follow-up?
No, but being it's a separate statute, the feedback from this board with respect to that statute, is it contemplated that this board provide feedback on that? Or that'll go its own path independent of us?
Sorry, provide feedback on the legislation or on whether or not to include those any provisions in?
Well, the legislation itself, as far as the draft that's out there. If one,
this board does not lobby.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we would certainly not advocate for or against any member of the board weighing in on this legislation. If you choose to, then that's your decision. Tim, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. Quick question. And I'm going to read the legislation here in a little bit. I wasn't aware of that, but with the comment about the resources, so if that piece of legislation passes unamended, which then sounds like it would give the board the opportunity to review those and potentially include those resources, when does this cross the line from the restriction of the board not being able to make this energy code more restrictive? Because clearly even the language that was removed into the real appendices, and now even with resources, if you adopt those, you're making the code more restrictive across the board. So would that be something that we'll get legal advice. I think we've already gotten the legal advice that the ordinance, I think, has language, or the legislation has language that says we can look at those appendices, and now it potentially even expanding into resources that are even more restrictive. I guess we'll cross that bridge when we get to it.
Yeah, I mean, Tim, I think
that'd be my recommendation, Tim, is that we cross that bridge on a case-by-case basis when we get to it. Yeah.
And I will also note too that we will know, and we will have an answer on whether this legislation is moving forward in a very short time, given that this legislative session only lasts for about another week and a half. So we will have a lot more concrete information by next meeting for sure, Tim.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions on the legislation?
Thank you for that discussion. I appreciate it.
Rob, thanks, Rob. Kim, I'll turn it back to you.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Adam, for going through that for everybody. Okay, so the next update that we've got for the board is hopefully exciting for everybody. So we met as a project management team last week to discuss, how to move forward with some of our board conversations, given that we don't have the 2024 code yet. And from that discussion, we realized maybe it would be a good thing to ask the ICC if, given that we are working on a new state code based on legislation, if we might be able to gain access to the final 2024 code ahead of its public release. So Adam reached out to ICC, and within 24 hours, they came back and said, sure, here's the code. So very exciting news. We have secured the 2024 redlined final code that will be released to the public soon. So thank you, Adam, for doing that outreach, and who knew it was so easy to ask for the code. So within that conversation, we also were kind of discussing how we make sure we give you all enough time with the new code to make sure that when we get back together to discuss it, we're all ready for that discussion. And so in the schedule that we'll propose to you on the next slide, the goal of the slight adjustments that we've made is to provide you all the time and space to read the code, review the code, figure out what questions you have on it, get those questions answered, and do basically conduct that full iterative review before we jump into a discussion about it. Now, the one thing that I want to note and emphasize, as is bolded on this slide, is that the code cannot be shared with anybody outside of the Energy Code Board. ICC gave us the code with the express direction that it is only to be used for this effort until it is publicly released. So we know that that might cause some blurred lines, given that all of you work to some degree in a space where you're using and referencing building codes. But we ask as much as possible for you all to keep the 2024 code to yourselves. Do not share it with any of your colleagues or other folks who might ask for it, and try to just use it specifically for this process until it is released to the public. Our plan is to send the 2024 code to you all following this meeting. We'll send that same reminder again in an email. And just so you all are aware, it is a redlined version of the 2021 code, which I think might be really helpful as you all review the code so you can see exactly what has changed between the 2021 and the 2024. So,
and Kim, I will just, I guess, maybe just jump in really quick and note too that ICC was clear that there may be still a few small edits or errata being considered as amendments to this, so that it may not be literally 100% complete, but essentially this will reflect all of the changes that were made in response to what the consensus committees approved and what the ICC board decision was. So it reflects the language that was removed from the base code and into appendices, and language that was removed from the appendices into resources, and all of that. So it is the most up to date, but there may still be a few very small changes between what we see and the actual final code when it's published.
Thanks, Adam.
So I was assured that none of those are going to be significant major changes, but just to know that there may be a few small tweaks still before the code is final.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam. So in light of this recent development, we decided to adjust a little bit our cadence, not our schedule of meetings, but the topics and flow of how we are going to discuss information over the next couple meetings, so that we make sure, again, that you all have enough time with this code before we jump into our deep dive discussions. So this on the slide is an outline of our schedule between now and the end of June. So looking ahead, we have on May 14th, meeting number 6, as well as our public webinar. So meeting number 6 is from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. The idea behind this meeting, we're still going to ask all of our board members to attend, is that it will primarily be a chance to have kind of a study session with this board, with Anna and Hope, Medina, to really deep dive into any early on questions that you guys might have about the 2024 code. We have not built out our meeting 6 agenda, but I would anticipate we will give you guys a legislative update if there is one to give. We'll have Anna go through where exactly some of those pieces of the code and the appendices that were up in the air, where those landed. And then our goal is to have, again, spend the rest of that 2-hour chunk going through questions that you guys have. So that means in advance of that meeting, we are hoping that you all might be able to start your review of the 2024 codes, start to look at it, start to log your questions and write them down. We'll likely carve out about half of our time together to answer commercial code questions and about half for residential code questions. That's just a tentative. If every question that you guys come up with is on the commercial code, that's where we'll spend our time and energy. So that's what's coming up for meeting number 6. On May 30th, we will still continue with our meeting 7, which is our first public engagement meeting. There's been no change to that. And then meeting 8 on June 11th will also be our public meeting debrief. So no change in the schedule there. In early June, our team is going to work on developing a survey that we will pass out to the board in early June, to get your guys' input on the 2024 code standards and how you think that they should or should not kind of be adjusted or adapted through this process. We're going to get that out at the beginning of the month and give you all 3 full weeks to complete that survey. So that way we can have the input, the early on input we need to guide and direct our conversations around the code requirements as we deep dive into those meetings. So early June, you all will get that survey. By on June 18th, we're going to add, it's not a required meeting, but it will be an optional study session for the board to attend, where if you guys have additional questions that come up after our May 14th meeting, you want to run those by Anna and Hope. We'll have an hour over the lunchtime hour that I believe it's on a Tuesday. To ask any questions that you have about the code. So we want to make sure as you guys are reviewing it, we're also providing that space for you to ask questions. And I'd encourage, even though it's optional, if you have a question, to maybe stick around and hear what other questions your fellow board members have, as that will kind of help bring everybody along together. But knowing how busy you all are, if it's just you want to pop in for 5 minutes, ask your question and pop out, that's okay too. We're considering these as like open office hours, more or less, for the board. On June 21st, we'll ask that you give us that survey back with all of your input on the 2024 code and how you'd like to see those conversations about the commercial and residential code focus. And then on our meeting on June 27th, meeting number 9, we'll discuss the survey input, discuss the code direction for residential and commercial, and any gaps the board wants to fill. And then from that meeting, we will basically create our plan to get through our commercial and residential code discussions. And from the meetings there on out, we will deep dive into those code discussions. So a lot of information I just shared. I will pause here. What questions do you guys have?
I assume you'll send out meeting invitations for these events, calendar invites?
Yes, Ron, we will send the invite out for the only one that's not on your calendars is the June 18th study session. So we'll invite folks to that after this meeting. And then we'll include in the email sort of the deadlines around the survey once we get that to you all, with many reminders. Okay. Well, if there are no questions, then we will plan to send the 2024 code to this board following today's meeting. And we'll include kind of an overview or a suggested schedule for you all's review to make sure that you can really leverage the study session on May 14th and June 18th to get your questions answered. And yeah, just grateful to the ICC for giving us the code ahead of time so we can start moving on these conversations. Tim.
Yeah, thank you. With the May 14th meeting, will it be possible to have the slide deck, I guess, that you guys are going to go over, sent out to the board to start doing a little studying, maybe have questions available? Or will that be ready that fast? It might be more beneficial to get questions on the docket there.
Yeah, Tim, that's something we'll have to probably coordinate with Anna on, and I'm not going to put you on the hot spot right now because I know how busy you are, as in addition to everybody. So Tim, we'll see if we can't at the very least maybe get the slide deck out a little ahead of that meeting. I would say though that we will send the 2024 final code right after this meeting, so hopefully that can at least act as the document to review in the meantime. Okay, well, is everyone excited to see the 2024 code? All right, cool. So that's all we had on that. You know, if questions come up, don't hesitate to reach out, and like I said, we'll send you all of that information via email. So the next bit we wanted to cover today is our update on the public webinar outreach. So we've put together our agenda for that public webinar. This is, again, as a reminder, May 14th. It's a Tuesday, and it's the afternoon following our next Energy Code Board meeting. You guys all, we want to encourage you all, if you're available during that time, to please try to attend. Our agenda is really going to focus and presentation around kind of giving folks an update and overview of what energy codes are and how they influence our lives, with the idea of simplifying energy codes in a way that feels very accessible to anybody who wants to attend that meeting. Not that, you know, the idea is not that we are just going to have folks steeped in technical knowledge on the codes, but really an opportunity to bring more folks that are not in this world day in and day out into our webinar. So as part of our webinar, we'll be asking for input on sort of the outcomes folks would like to see through a new building code standard, and then also getting input on our public engagement process. And so we may make some adaptations to our process based on the results of the webinar, but TBD on how that discussion goes. So for our outreach for the webinar, even though Adam is on vacation, we're going to ask very, very nicely that he send out information on the webinar via the CEO listserv today, so we can get that out. We'll be posting on our social media as Lotus. We're going to see if we can't get it on the CEO's social media. And then we also have a social post for you all to be sharing it with your networks, which is that last bullet. We need support from the board. So your homework, and in addition to reviewing the 2024 code, is to please invite your networks to join or register for the webinar. And as you send out those notices, just remember that people are busy and ignore emails. So the more reminders you can send, the more chance we might get of folks registering and showing up. If you all have community social medias, individual social medias, company LinkedIn, whatever you think might be appropriate, we will have, like as I said, a social media post for you to share. And all of that is contained in our outreach toolkit. So within the toolkit, which we will email to you after this meeting, we have social media posts, email template language that you can use and adapt as you'd like, and graphics. Now, the one thing I'll share is if you adapt the language, we did translate everything into Spanish. And so if you adapt any of the English language, note, we will not necessarily be able to help you in supporting the translation of that. So the as written English version is the Spanish version as well. So just keep that in mind. And yeah, and so we'll send that to you guys after this, and we'll ask that as soon as you're able to this week and into next week, you're sending that to your networks. Again, the webinar is a mere 2 weeks away, so the more outreach and push we can give to it early on, hopefully the more attendance we'll be able to get. So that's all I've got on webinar outreach. The one thing I also wanted to flag is that we are going to plan to ask when folks register for the webinar if they need Spanish translation or not, given that we're doing all of this or have available outreach in Spanish. If we get folks that say they do need translation, we will plan to have live translation happen during that webinar so that anybody who attends can participate. Any questions for us on the webinar outreach? Okay. I'm not hearing any, but if they come up, as always, don't hesitate to reach out. We'll share all the materials following this meeting. And yeah, just thank you in advance for taking the time to get the word out to your networks about this effort. Okay, so I think with that, that's all the admin items that we had for folks. I'm just going to check the chat real quick, make sure. Oh, yay. Cool. Thanks, Kelly. Make sure that wasn't a question. And Anna, I will pass it over to you.
Okay. So today we're going to talk about a smattering of the above code language that different jurisdictions in Colorado have adopted. We have not included every jurisdiction, and we have just kind of selected a few to kind of cover the different climate zones in the different areas of the state. So the first one, and these are in no particular order, it's just as I went through their codes. So the first one here is Lafayette. And we're really only going to be talking about the amendments to the residential 2021 IECC. So there are 3 pathways in Lafayette for residential buildings to comply with the 2021 IECC. The first is the prescriptive pathway. So what they have done is said all electric buildings are only required to have 1 additional energy efficiency package from section R 408.2. So those packages we talked about a few meetings ago. However, mixed fuel buildings are required to have 3 additional efficiency packages from section R 408.2, and one of those packages must address the envelope. So one of those packages must include envelope efficiency strategies. And then great comment from Kim here in the chat. We have the resource that we used is linked in each of the title slides for each different jurisdiction that we're covering today. For the performance pathway for residential buildings, the all electric buildings are only required to have 5% less annual energy costs than the baseline modeled, and mixed fuel buildings are required to have 20% less annual energy costs than the baseline. And then the ERI pathway also has a difference between all electric building targets and mixed fuel building targets. Both building types are required to show a 5% savings from the target, but the target for all electric buildings is 55, and for the mixed fuel buildings, it's 50. And then the electric ready and EV provisions have been adopted as well. Any questions or comments on Lafayette's residential code? Great. The next is Basalt's Sustainable Building Regulations amendments and beneficial electrification. Again, both of those resources are linked there. So here we're going to talk through both commercial and residential. The commercial code requirements. So what was interesting about basalt is that they require additional air barrier testing is required, and any leaks that are found are required to be fixed if the leakage rate exceeds a specific value. And this code language aligns really well with what we saw in the amendments to the 2024 IECC, or to the 2020, the updated air barrier leakage testing in the 2024 IECC. So I thought it was really interesting that they pulled in some of that language. And then the maximum allowable ventilation rates are not allowed to exceed 120% of the required outdoor airflow rate that's listed in the IMC. So they cannot completely overventilate the building and use a lot of additional outdoor air. The residential code amendments include three pathways. So we have the prescriptive compliance. This is only available to homes that are 2,000 square feet or less. They must show a res check showing that the envelope is 5% better than the code minimum. So again, targeting some additional envelope measures to increase the efficiency of the building. The performance pathway must show 5% savings when compared to the standard reference design. They've also mandated energy recovery for all homes. And then for any building, or I'm sorry, any house over 2,000 square feet, there is a mandatory HERS score of 40. However, if that home is all electric, that HERS is 45. Any questions so far? Great. All right. They also have included requirements for renewables.
Anna, real quick, it looks like Ron might have a question.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was just curious, on the previous slide, that HERS target of 40, do you know if that includes the impacts of on-site renewable energy?
It does.
It does. Okay, thank you.
So renewables, new residential buildings are required to install 3 watts per square foot of conditioned floor area, or 25% of the annual energy use in on-site renewable energy rather than of. If it's an all-electric home, that requirement is reduced down to 2 watts per square foot, or 15% of the home's expected annual energy use. For commercial buildings, they are required to have a 40% of the roof area is required to be solar ready, and they are required to offset 25% of their annual energy cost with on-site renewables. That requirement is reduced to 15% if the building is all electric. Hope, did you have something to add? Feel free to jump in, Hope. And then we have the battery ready, electric ready, solar ready, and EV ready requirements for residential and commercial. And then EV capable, there's also EV capable spaces required for commercial as well. So some of that language, oh, go ahead, Adam.
I was just going to ask about the battery ready, since we obviously saw language in 2024 for what energy storage ready. Do you have a sense for how much this might align generally with either the readiness approach or the mandatory approach or whatever?
Yeah, so it aligns pretty closely with the readiness approach. They require space to be dedicated in the building for a future battery storage system for the solar ready area for the PV that would be provided in the solar ready area of the building. And then they also require initial electric infrastructure as well, such as future panel boards. space for future panel boards.
And it's essentially has to be sized or, prepared to be sized to accommodate the on-site renewable requirement. Is that what you said?
Correct. That 40% solar ready area.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Sure. Next. There are requirements as well around exterior energy use. So there is a renewable energy mitigation program spreadsheet where you enter in the amount of exterior energy use you have, things like outdoor heaters or snow melt. And some of that energy is going to be required to be offset by on-site renewables.
And I guess just a quick clarification on that. PV is not required, but it can be used to reduce the fee associated with the exterior energy use.
Yeah. We did include a little bit about the existing buildings and alterations here. I know we haven't talked much about them yet, but we just wanted to give you a quick overview of how they incorporated that. So type 1 residential existing building alterations are going to require additional efficiency around air leakage. So there is a test done before construction and after construction, and they have to show a 15% improvement in air changes per hour as compared to conditions pre-renovation. If that's a level 3 alteration, you still have to show that same 15% improvement. And then the electric ready and solar ready requirements are going to come into play based on some additional factors around the floor area and percent of the home that is being altered. Type 2 commercial construction, again, have to show that 15% improvement in air changes per hour as compared to the pre-renovation conditions. And then the renewables and electric ready provisions are required as well when you are a level 3 alteration.
I think this is the last slide for basalt, so just wanted to make sure their board has no questions on this.
Great. So then we have the Breckenridge and Summit Energy amendments to the residential IECC. So these are really closely aligned, and we just married them together for the sake of brevity. Compliance options include the DOE Zero Homes Energy Program, or 2 other options, which is the first one is shown here, the prescriptive option. And I've listed here the mandatory requirements of this prescriptive option. So we have the increased thermal insulation requirements, all condensing gas appliances, if you have those, high efficiency heat pumps, all LED lighting, water sense fixtures, energy recovery, a maximum 30% window to wall ratio, programmable thermostats, and blower door testing. The next option is slightly less stringent, but requires on-site solar array. So you have a slightly less stringent increased thermal insulation level. And then the only other change here is the blower door test is slightly less stringent under this option, but then you also have to provide PV, which is sized to offset 25% of the annual energy use of the home. So a little bit of flexibility there. However, there is no flexibility within this. So if they do not meet these mandatory requirements, they have to comply with the DOE Zero Homes program. Go ahead, Adam.
Do we have any sense for the differentiation in how effective these different pathways are? I mean, I would assume that the zero energy ready is probably the most restrictive
Yes.
of these three pathways, but do we have a sense for like how much less restrictive the alternatives are?
Mm.
I don't know if there was any analysis that they had done or anything that you're aware of.
I don't have any information on that. Does anyone else have experience in there in that?
I don't know if Jesse has an idea, given that she is in Breckenridge, but
Yeah, my apologies. I actually just ducked out to use the restroom, but we actually are not seeing hardly anybody use the PV prescription option. We're seeing people really based on home size either use Zero Energy Ready or the 2021 pathway with amendments that's required, which I might have missed if you had talked about that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we actually haven't seen the PV one hardly at all. I'm not really sure anecdotally why people are not choosing that pathway.
Interesting.
And then to answer your question, no, we didn't do the analysis. There's a whole backstory as to how we landed on these to begin with. But it was more around consensus than modeling above code things.
gotcha. Thanks. I have a follow-up, but I'll let Ron go first.
I was just going to say that there's definitely some elements of the Zero Energy Ready Home program that go a little bit outside of what we would consider to be strictly energy performance. So things like water consumption and air quality. So those, it's not exactly a straight apples to apples comparison between the two programs. And I would say just from looking at this list, one of the reasons why I suspect it's not selected that often is some of these things are sort of administratively a little bit complicated to keep on top of, like specifically once you start prescribing the window to wall area ratios, it's a really administratively time-consuming process for both the applicant and staff. Every time something changes and windows get moved around or adjusted, and you have to go back and recalculate, and that sort of confusion that comes from that, we found in Boulder County has been really sort of difficult on all parties.
That's really helpful to understand. And I will say that these other two pathways that were provided were really in response to, and I think maybe this is where the window piece comes in, were in response to the large homes that we were seeing. And so they just they didn't work well under Zero Energy Ready because the model home there was less than 2,500 square feet. And then they wanted to have all this customization. And so these pathways were sort of designed with that large custom home in mind. So that's a little bit of the behind the scenes why we had these options.
We're seeing large custom homes that are meeting the Zero Energy Ready Home program in Boulder County.
That's what I told people.
Yeah.
They can do it.
Yeah. And we've had a huge uptick in those since the Marshall Fire. So we've had a lot of them since the Marshall Fire.
So maybe I'll just ask the other question I was going to have, Jesse, since we have the benefit of your particular direct experience with these. Wondering how you said that the Zero Energy Ready and the first prescriptive pathway are what most people are choosing. Have you gotten a sense for? I guess I'd be curious just to hear a little bit about the response that you've received from the builder community, contractor community, customers, like the people, consumers, like and how they're reacting to all of this, and like if a lot of them are going with Zero Energy Ready, are they happy with that? Is that something that they like? Are they appreciative that that's required, or are you getting pushback?
We got some pushback. We rolled this out at the worst time. It was like March of 2020. And we had all these plans to do, training and outreach and all of the best practices, and it all just fell flat. So when people started building again in 2020, 2021, there was a lot of backtracking on how builders had to become certified through DOE, et cetera. And so it just took a lot longer than we had hoped. And in that process, there was just a lot of pushback, like, you know, zero energy is too hard. It doesn't fit these larger custom homes. What other options are available? And so we kind of, frankly, threw together the other pathways to help alleviate that. We also thought we would see a lot more folks moving from the prescriptive pathways to more performance-based. And the feedback that we got was, please just tell us what to do. Just give us the checklist. Like, we don't want to, even on a custom home, we don't want to have to figure out the energy model, right? Like, just give us the checklist. And so that's why I think we've seen a lot of people do the 2021 pathway, because it's very prescriptive. I mean, it tells you exactly what you have to do. So those were some of the things. We don't get as much pushback on zero energy anymore because everyone's kind of gotten to a place where they're certified and they've had the trainings, and we addressed a couple of the climate zone 7 issues that we were seeing. Yeah, I don't think we're really getting a lot of pushback on that anymore. We are hearing from our energy modelers, though. So actually, Adam, this probably goes back to your original question about the efficiency of the other two pathways. And we are hearing from the energy modelers that they, not only is this one maybe too complicated, but it's not, from their perspective, as good, as robust. And so they're not pushing people this direction either. And so they have some recommendations on this, but I wouldn't want to spend too much time tweaking this one because we know it's not working very well.
Yeah, that's helpful and interesting. And I think, I'm sorry to pick on you, but I feel like, you know, we should leverage your experience with this while we're talking about it. And I think, you know, generally a lot of what I'm hearing, a big moral of the story here is that, you know, a lot of these things are achievable. It's just we need to give people time and you know, work these changes in and you know, get people experienced with it, and then it's going to work.
The only other like major theme that I would point out is that we have so much concern around wall assemblies and continuous insulation aspects. Like, it just, they cannot seem to overcome that, no matter who we bring in and show them different ways of doing it, and peer-to-peer learning. It tends to be the one thing that they're like, no, we just absolutely cannot, will not, do not want to do this. It's too risky. And we hear that over and over and over and over and over again.
Interesting. Thanks. Well, I've hogged a lot of time, so Rob, please go ahead.
This is really good. Thanks, Adam and Jesse. Go ahead, Rob.
Sorry, I was trying to get all my stuff clicked on. One, I'm going to put out, I'm going to, you know, it's relevant, but I'll put out a shameless plug. Next week, we're offering training on Zero Energy Ready Homes version 2 and Energy Star Next Gen in Colorado. And if you build in our service territory, it's discounted. And so, you know, I think we can at least make resources available for people who want to go to that, who want to build to that standard, and we have that available. Frankly, I think it also it bears mentioning that we've struggled to fill a classroom, and this is the second time we've offered it. Even though it's 80% off and it's in town and it's done by the highest by you know, board, cook, and construction instruction, you know, you couldn't ask for better resources. And we cannot get butts in seats. And so I think that's it's both. It's both. You know, I'd like to see, if you're interested, sign up for the training. We got it next week. But you know, we are definitely struggling to get even with discounts, to get buy-in from the builder community.
Interesting. Thanks, Rob. Ron?
Yeah, I was just going to add just one last thought looking at this slide here. When comparing the Zero Energy Home program to a prescriptive list, one thing to keep in mind is that the Zero Energy Ready Home program does a really good job of testing and verification of a lot of the nitty-gritty details, especially related to the HVAC system. So I think in many ways the customers ultimately get a little bit more of what they paid for through that additional testing and verification that happens, and that happens for elements that are sort of outside of the scope of building inspectors. So it's one of the other reasons why I think the Zero Energy Ready Home program is a good solution and tends to work better than even a comprehensive but prescriptive list.
Great. Thanks, Ron. Go ahead, Kim.
Yeah, I just wanted to circle back to Jesse's comment around the wall assembly and continuous installation and their perceived risk. And risk was not the word I was expecting you to use in that context, Jesse. So I'm curious if you can elaborate just like on where folks are seeing the risk.
Moisture. They're worried about moisture not passing through the wall assemblies adequately. And even though everything else around in the code is showing you how to build an assembly that will do such, they just don't, the last thing they want is the homeowner to come back and say, I have mold in my house and we're in a ridiculously dry climate, etc. And
I don't want to even start to try to unpack what's wrong with that.
What? Sorry, what's that?
I mean, I don't even begin where to start to unpack what's wrong with the idea that adding water that it increases insulation problems or moisture problems. If it's detailed correctly, it doesn't. I don't know. Sorry.
Maybe we should unpack
fine.
that a little bit.
I'm raising it here as an issue because I agree with you. And yet it continues to be a major narrative that we hear and that we are trying to overcome. And so I'm naming that as something that is a challenge and we need to be aware of.
Are these builders who are not installing active ventilation?
I have no idea. I'm just in the stakeholder.
That is a huge mitigating factor.
Plans.
Wouldn't Indoor Air Plus require, and if we're talking climate zones, 6 and 7 anyway, I think ERVs are part of the current code. And
exactly.
to get Indoor Air Plus, I think you also need to provide active balanced ventilation too. So there's no ventilation requirements. If you do continuous insulation, especially if you're doing a vapor impermeable, you're keeping water out of the wall assembly. I don't understand where they think it's going to get wet. It's much more likely to rot if you don't skin it, because your framing members are going to be colder and thus get condensate on them and thus rot. So there's I think a logical misunderstanding here that is really kind of fundamental and concerning.
And thanks, Robin. Ron, I'll go to you, and then I want to make sure we pull it over to Hope, who had a helpful comment in the chat to maybe help explain where some of that concern's coming from. So, Ron, I'll start with you.
Yeah. I don't know that this is the place to have a detailed building science discussion of how to build a proper wall assembly. I think it is an appropriate place to acknowledge that there's a lot of concerns out there, and I know in Boulder County when we started pushing for much more insulation in the walls, and specifically pushing exterior insulation, there was a lot of concerns from every trade that came in contact with the wall assembly that they were unfamiliar with. They just, there's a lot of ways to do it right, but there's also quite a few ways to get it wrong. And the industry is fearful of changes that cause increased risk. And so I think whatever we do here, we need to make sure we're also outreaching with proper education that covers all the climate zones that we have in our state. I think we need to make sure we give people the tools to do it right. I think it's really essential that we acknowledge their concerns and their fears, because we are asking them to do something different than what they're used to. And ultimately, they are on the hook financially for something when a problem occurs. So I think we are right to move forward and push for these things, but I also think it's incumbent upon us to make sure we're giving them all the tools they need to be successful with that.
Thank you, Rob. Appreciate that. Bringing us back into the context of the board in our focus here. Hope, I wanted to give you a chance to share your comment if you wanted to elaborate the comment you dropped in the chat.
Just the concern about the moisture in the wall is because there's a disconnect between the requirements out of the IRC and the IBC dealing with vapor retarder controls and how it works with the thermal envelope components of the energy code and the misconception of that continuous insulation, because they're putting a class 1 on the exterior with that continuous insulation and then a class 1 of the plastic on the inside. And that's where the concern is. I think it's just re-educating them and making sure that they're aware of the two separate requirements that do work together.
Thank you, Hope. Yeah, Carolyn.
Yeah, and Kim, just so that we make sure we captured, I just wanted to note the two notes in the Q&A from Chad Arthur around this topic as well, and just make sure we capture those in our record.
Thank you, Carolyn. I was going to call those out, but I appreciate you doing that. Yeah, so folks want to take a look at the Q&A and read Chad's thoughts. We'll make sure those are captured in our meeting materials as well. All right. And I'm back to you.
Great. Let's hop down to the next jurisdiction we're going to talk about, which is Golden. So to talk about the Golden Sustainability Menu, we know that it covers a wide range of topics. And today we're only going to talk about those that are relevant to the energy code. So there's quite a bit that we've skipped. So there are mandatory requirements that the PV system must offset 10% of the annual modeled electric consumption. Programmable thermostats are mandatory. They must exceed the required savings in Section C407 for the performance pathway in the IECC by an additional 4%. So in the 2021 IECC unamended, it was a 20% savings, and now we need to save an additional 4%. EV charging and EV ready infrastructure has been included in the sustainability menu. There is a maximum fenestration U value of 0.25 compared to U 0.30 in the IECC. And then water sense fixtures are mandatory, and a heat reflective roof with a minimum 29 SRI is required. So then there are two additional sections of the sustainability menu. This first one is called the guidelines, and we're only talking about the energy sections, and this is where teams get to pick and choose what works best for their building. So the options here, the energy sections of the guidelines are in building automation system for advanced monitoring, energy recovery over what is mandated within the IECC, and then another additional option for daylighting or passive lighting for 20% of internal spaces. Any questions about those? Go ahead, Tim. Saw your camera click on.
Yep, thank you. The daylighting or passive lighting provision, is that just for the new construction, or do they have anything slotted in for on the existing building portion, like tenant finishes? That question always comes up from electrical engineers to me.
Within Golden, particularly?
Well, just generally speaking, but for this particular slide, is it just for the new construction?
So this is within the guidelines section, so they can pick and choose. This is not a mandatory requirement. So this is new construction and renovations or alterations are required to meet certain levels. And I believe the guidelines is a percent. So you have to meet a certain percent of the guidelines. And this one would be available if they could meet it, I believe. But if they cannot meet it, they do not have to comply with it. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
And then the third part of the sustainability menu is options, and this is the points section. So there are points available. You have to increase energy efficiency, 1 point, and 1 point is available for every 2% increase in energy efficiency above the 4% that is mandated. You can offset traditional energy uses with renewable energy production, and there's 1 point for every 4% reduction in energy use. And then if you install additional EV chargers, level 2 or higher plugins are required, you can get additional points. Go ahead, Adam.
Is it part of the mandatory requirements that a certain number of either these guidelines or options are complied with, or are they completely voluntary?
It is part of the mandatory of the sustainability menu that a certain number of them are required based on your type of construction. So new construction versus renovation, or and I believe the size of the building as well. Go ahead, Kevin.
Just curious if you know if that has any correlation for the EV plugins. Does that have any correlation to parking requirements? Seems unlikely, but sometimes they get lumped together.
Can you repeat your question, Kevin? Sorry, I had a hard time hearing you.
Oh, sorry about that. I was just wondering if it had any correlation to parking requirements for the EV plug-in components for those additional ones.
I'm not sure. I know what you're asking. I'd have to dig into it a little bit more to see how they align.
Yeah.
Okay. Our next jurisdiction we're going to talk about is Superior. So these are the amendments to the 2021 IECC. The 2018 IECC code is still available for residential properties impacted by the Marshall Fire. So the commercial amendments to the 2021 IECC, commercial buildings are required to be all electric unless new combustion equipment meets more efficient HVAC performance. And those efficiency requirements are a 10% heating efficiency requirement, and then electric ready space and future electric ready infrastructure is also required to be provided. EV charging and EV ready, Appendix CD has also been adopted. The residential amendments are really similar. Residential buildings are required to be all electric unless gas furnaces, gas boilers, and on-demand water heaters are condensing. And then we have the requirement for future electric capacity or future electric infrastructure for a replacement for future electric equipment. EV charging and the EV ready Appendix RD has also been adopted. Are there any questions or comments on Superior?
So I guess the only question I would ask, or it may be more of a comment than a question, but it looks to me like this is, even though it seems to almost follow like an all electric required, pathway, except that there are those exceptions for the really high efficiency gas. Would this be something that, I guess I'd be curious as to how this, and I don't know if you know or Hope or somebody else here, how this compares to some of the other electric preferred pathways, given that we've gotten a lot of different, a lot of comments from folks in the last few meetings about it, or a real interest in an electric preferred pathway. I guess I'm just trying to understand like how the different approaches to doing that are working, and how they compare to one another. So I don't know if that's that may be a big question that we can't answer today, but I'm just curious if anyone has any thoughts on that.
I don't have any information on how successful this has been, or how some of the other electric preferred codes, how successful they've been, but we can look into it for sure. Go ahead, Carolyn.
Yeah, I was just going to offer to Adam's comment. I think the pathway we typically see in electric preferred is an overall performance requirement increase. So if it's a mixed fuel building, it has to then exceed like the model baseline by a higher percentage, as opposed to being prescriptive around specific equipment and their performance. So, continuing to allow the builder or design team to apply the appropriate compensation as is appropriate for the building, but setting a more stringent requirement for that building as a whole.
And Carolyn, I think to me that almost sounds like a more or an approach that's harder to object to from an EPCA perspective as well, just because I think when you start mandating like you must meet certain efficiency thresholds with your equipment that exceeds federal minimums, you start getting in a little bit more water there. But if you have a more of a overall, your performance has to be this percentage improvement over baseline, then you're not specifically mandating that, well, the equipment maybe doesn't have to exceed federal minimums, but you make up for that efficiency loss in other areas. And
right, that's going to be like the ways to do it are either like like if you're using, you have to model, let's just say 10% better than the baseline for an all electric, then you might need to do like 15% better than baseline for a mixed fuel. The other one I have seen growing in use is that increase in points for the above points. So if it's, let's just say it's, again, these are just nominal examples, but let's just say it's an all electric building, you have to earn 10 points, whereas if it's a mixed fuel building, you have to earn 15 points.
Right.
So those would be the two that I tend to think are in the space that still preserves that flexibility and likely is solider ground to be on.
Gotcha. I agree. Thanks.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Adam, you started to touch upon this and did touch upon it just on the federal minimum. So with the exception here, is it the intent here that this would still be compliant the way this slide is shown? Because some of us may prefer the way this is shown.
Sorry, compliant with what?
Well, the federal minimum, that it doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an attorney, and I don't want to weigh into like the legal implications of what the impacts of this could, or whether or not this will be compliant with federal requirements, or whether this would in any way like supersede federal requirements. I mean, on its face, to me, it seems like it might potentially cause some consternation in that you're saying you either must have all electric appliances or you must have gas appliances that exceed the federal minimum requirements. And to me, that would give me a little potential heartburn of requiring.
I know on the flip side, there's some of us, let's say in some of the current jurisdictions, that preference all electric, but give one the opportunity, if one wants to characterize it as an opportunity, to use traditional fuel burning. I don't know if every jurisdiction has necessarily thought through some of the ripple effects as to what else may be necessary to achieve that, and were some of the steps necessary to achieve it fully contemplated. So at least if it's through equipment, alternate equipment, if it's through the building envelope, if it's through other means, think his hope had indicated it's not necessarily the intent to go down that road, but there's only so many paths for one to use to make up that increment. And some of those are, I don't think the consequences or those paths have been fully thought through by everybody, and maybe they have.
Well, and Andrew, I think that there would be some arguments, in kind of the approach that Carolyn was talking about, where, a design team could certainly go down the route of just of utilizing higher efficiency equipment as your solution to that problem, but that it wouldn't necessarily be limiting to having that be the only possible pathway. And I think that's where some of the concerns about federal preemption get brought into the conversation, because if you limit appliance efficiency thresholds to be the only way to achieve the required outcome, then that's where you start getting into some potentially challengeable regulations. So I think it's just something, I don't know that we need to dive into that today. I know that there's a lot of interest in electric preferred, and we're going to be talking about that, I'm sure, in many future conversations, but that was just kind of my initial question, seeing this versus how I've seen other electric preferred approaches.
Yeah, and just as a clarification, if I may, I think we were also speaking to this as a optional appendix, just for clarity.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Carolyn. Andrew, does that feel like you addressed your question?
For the moment, it starts to. I may, at least in the current viewing of this, could say that this may be a preferred approach, that it's a more simple, and whether or not it's better or not better, maybe less material because it's prescribed, and it may not pass muster, but as an alternate, it could be a viable route, at least sitting here looking at it in the current context.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Andrew. David, I saw you had come off camera for a moment. I didn't know if you wanted to jump in and add any thoughts there.
Tempted to, but unless there's a direct question, I'm not going to opine on that, I don't think.
Okay, thanks, David. Just wanted to double check. Tim, you're up next.
Yeah, thank you. One comment would be, I think I'm for an electric preferred approach. Clearly, it's been what I've been saying for a while, but I think with that being said, that I think it's critical that we keep the couple of different options in, whether it's performance or prescriptive, and then figure out how to model both of those approaches to be electric preferred. Kind of in line with Andrew's comments, at least on what the slide is. Some builders, we have some production builders that choose not to go performance, and they prefer, let's go prescriptive, just tell us how to do it. So that's just my comment on what I'd be trying to move forward with. Thanks.
Tim. Just wanted to check, no other hands. I saw a couple go up and go down, so everyone's comments are addressed, questions addressed. Okay. Anna, back to you.
Great. So the next section jurisdiction we're going to talk about is Lakewood. So these are the energy provisions of the enhanced development menu. So again, Lakewood has a enhanced development menu that covers a broad range of air quality and water quality and site categories, but today we're only talking about the energy provisions of that enhanced development menu. So this is applicable for new attached dwellings, multifamily buildings, mixed use, non-residential divisions, and subdivisions creating lots for 3 or more residential units. Any square footage within these buildings that is dedicated to affordable housing is excluded from the gross floor area requirements. Gross floor area calculations. And the gross floor area is used to calculate the amount of points that you are required to get. Fee in lieu is an option. You pay per point not achieved. So just talking about the energy efficiency options here, there is an option for energy efficient outdoor lighting. So providing dark sky lighting and all LED. On-site renewables, there are points achieved based on the amount of electricity that is being offset by your on-site system. Off-site renewables are also available for points. They must be within a renewable electricity subscription or a community solar garden, and a 15-year period is required. Additional renewable energy systems such as geothermal, solar thermal, or passive solar design will also achieve points. Building electrification is a way to achieve points, so offsetting or using electricity instead of natural gas. And then any above code EV charging stations that are provided also achieve additional points. In addition to the enhanced development menu, they have to show compliance with the greenhouse gas mitigation program. And these two things, the development menu and the greenhouse gas mitigation program, kind of work hand in hand together. You can use an energy model or CBEX data to calculate baseline emissions, so you don't have to have an energy model. But there are multiple mitigation measures. So on-site renewables that you're providing can show additional, can show how much greenhouse gases you are mitigating, but then also can be used for the enhanced development menu. Same for off-site renewables, those renewable energy systems we talked about, the building electrification. And then they also have an option for recycling and compost contracts, and EV parking above code. So those same energy options that were within the enhanced development menu, which is again much wider than just the energy portion of the menu, also work hand in hand with showing the amount of greenhouse gases that are being mitigated. And that calculation there's a whole book on how to do that calculation for them, but your target is calculated based on the size of your building and the type of construction as well. Andrew, did you have a comment or a question?
No, I didn't.
Okay. Kim?
Just a quick question. How much of the greenhouse gases are required to be mitigated?
So there's a calculation that's required, and I didn't want to provide that here. But essentially you are, I'd have to pull up the actual equation.
I guess I was just thinking, what is it, is it a percent of total emissions for the building, or is it 100%?
No, it is not 100%. It is a percent. You calculate a performance standard for your building type based on metric tons of carbon emissions per square foot for non-residential and metric tons of carbon emissions per person for residential. So the calculations are a little bit different, and that gives you a total amount of greenhouse gases that are required to be mitigated. It's not based off of the baseline performance. It is based off of the, I don't want to kind of like explain this. So when we are calculating, so when we're calculating building electrification, so offsetting the emissions that would be created by using natural gas in the baseline, you can calculate that delta, and that's how you calculate the mitigated greenhouse gases from electrifying. But the actual performance standard that you are trying to meet is based on the square footage of your building for non-residential and per capita per person for residential. Sorry, that was a bad way to explain it.
That's okay. No, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
All right. Well, I think that takes us to the end of our above code landscape review. So before we jump into some discussion questions we have for the board, any final thoughts or questions for Anna on any of the code standards we've looked at today?
I'd just like to say thank you. This has been really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, cool. So these discussion questions are meant to just sort of get you guys thinking about how these standards could that we looked at today could apply to our future conversations around the low energy and carbon code. And so we just have a few questions to get you all thinking, and we don't need to go through them one by one, but as you have thoughts on any of these questions, would love to just kind of start sparking some conversation amongst the board about approaches we liked and didn't like within those codes we looked at. So the first question, does the board like or dislike any of the above code approaches developed by Colorado communities? Considering that, with the lens of considering how they might apply to our low energy and carbon code. Did this review give you all any inspiration on different code approaches we could consider for the low energy and carbon code? What approaches did we see today that offer, or that you all know of that we can bring up, offer simple and easy to understand code? What approaches seem like they might be overly complicated? And considering that we're building a code for the full state, are there elements we should not consider from these example codes? So yeah, just a couple questions to get folks thinking. And Carolyn, I'll let you start us off.
Yeah, within the residential code elements, I do like some of the strategies that folks are using around allowing different certifications as streamlined paths towards demonstrating compliance. Acknowledging that we have, for example, utility rebates or other things that are tied to those as well. And so there's other, potential incentives that add, value stack on top of our code requirements. So certainly I think there's some appeal to creating some of those pathways as something that can be helpful and create more flexibility, specifically in the residential.
Awesome. Thank you, Carolyn. Don?
As we went through this process, I'm seeing a lot of representations here from the resort communities, the resort counties. And I think we got to remember that not all of Colorado lives in the resort or lives in the urban area. And some of this stuff is a challenge. We've got, here on the West Slope on the eastern side of Colorado, it's not an easy process to get builders to build for moderate income people. So I kind of like, we saw some choices of gas as long as it's condensing. I think energy recovery is great, but there's still costs involved. And I think we need to keep in mind that, if we're implementing this for the entire state is not a ski area or an urban area. So those are my 2 cents.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for that, Don. It's always a good reminder. Rob, I'll go to you next.
Yeah. So, I think some of the earlier examples we looked at were communities that provided that had easier or lower hurdles to get over for all electric construction. That is, that raises a concern for me for a couple of reasons. For better or for worse, electricity on a per BTU basis is more expensive than gas. And so I'd be concerned about the impact that would have, that would ultimately have on customer energy bills if we make it easier to build all electric housing. I'm also kind of concerned about the we can do this on the basis of individual houses, but we start talking about, we've got 16,000 houses going up in our service territory every single year. We start talking about electrifying that many houses without us focusing really heavily on energy efficiency and heating loads and keeping that really, really low, that's going to be more bigger transformers, more power lines, more substations, more capacity, more electrons we're going to have to try to find. And so that's where some of those, that's where my concerns would be with making all electric housing easier to achieve than split fuel housing.
Thanks, Rob. Appreciate your thoughts. Kim.
I guess wanted to address one of what things that Don said was that the whole state isn't resort area. And I cover a region that is very diverse, from an area of the county that I live in that includes Telluride and Mountain Village, and the part of the county that doesn't even have building codes that get enforced. So we deal with that diversity throughout, not only this county, but the region here. And one of the ways that we deal with it is by increasing the stringency for energy efficiency as homes get larger. And I don't know if that's an option or a possibility that we can consider with the state code, for house size to be a part of the consideration, but that does help to address those considerations related to really small, lower income type of housing compared to 20,000 plus square foot houses. So.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. It's an interesting topic, and I haven't heard it come up yet, but I'll be curious what other board members think about that. Carolyn.
Yeah, this series of comments prompted me to weigh in. I think just as a point of clarification, I think we should be distinct when we're having these conversations about whether we're talking about base code versus potential things that would go into optional appendices that can be adopted by local jurisdictions if it's appropriate for their context. So I think when we're talking about some of these, whether it's electric preferred options or even an all electric requirement, first, I think statute gives us the guardrails for what can be in the base code. And so when, I support things like, electric preferred or all electric, again, it's more to create a standardized appendix that jurisdictions that need to move in that direction can adopt it. I think I also just kind of need to respond to Rob's point, which is, I think, once again, we need to remind ourselves that we are building highly, highly efficient homes under either the 2021 or 2024 IECC. And I very much object to the alarmist conversation around these are somehow going to destroy the grid when, even an all electric brand new home is going to use far less electricity than a 1950 poor performing home with central air conditioning and or other tools. So I just want to make sure that we're not in that space and instead just kind of staying within, the scope of this, and also acknowledging that statewide there's a high variability in what gas and electric prices are. And so let's not just get hung up by a single utility provider's perspective.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. Ron?
Yeah, I just want to second what Kim suggested about varying rules based upon house sizes. Boulder County has been doing that since 2009. It's been working very well, and I think it's an appropriate way to sort of deal with affordability for people who are really trying to build modest homes, but make sure that folks who are building very large homes are compensating for the high carbon footprint for that those large homes and the increased energy consumption. So I do think that if the board has a way to implement something that is skewed based upon a home size, I think that's a really appropriate approach.
Right, thank you, Ron. Tim.
Yeah, thank you. Here. I'm all in favor of a size threshold. Based on, Brian, you hit the nail on the head, I think, and based on the size of the homes, the bigger the impact. The bigger the home, the bigger the impact. And I also serve on Division of Housing Technical Advisory Committee, which I just had another meeting this morning. And along with that, what that group is charged with doing is adopting the first phase of this low electric ready and solar ready code. And just last year, the Division of Housing was charged with starting to set up a tiny home to be able to pull tiny homes through the Division of Housing and actually inspect them and permit them, which was a good thing for people who live in Colorado. And the tiny home group, lobby group, or the groups are freaking out, to use a technical term, with the way the energy code reads, because they're like 400 square foot or less, and the whole concept of, you know, pushing attainable housing in the legislation that's probably going to make it through to require jurisdictions to allow ADUs. And then if we keep making the energy code for across the board for any size structure, it's really affecting the cost. So I think setting somehow the parameters for size thresholds absolutely, in my opinion, has to be included as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Kristen.
Just echo that I also like the size variation and perhaps reducing some of the requirements for smaller homes and especially tiny homes.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. And Carolyn just noted in the chat that Boulder also allows a prescriptive pathway for homes 1,000 square feet or smaller. Okay, so it sounds like an approach that the board appreciated in the review of our different code options is the inclusion of that home size as the lever that can make, you know, to enforce more requirements on larger homes. Is there anything that folks did not like or did not think was an approach that made sense for a statewide code standard? Yeah, Ron?
I would just be a little bit wary about any complicated prescriptive list or performance list, for that matter, that has a lot of staff time taken up by just trying to figure out how to administer it. I think we have a responsibility to try and make sure that these codes are efficient to actually use, both in terms of the building departments and the builders. And part of that, I think, comes with simplicity. So I think the simpler we can make things and the less complicated the documentation that is needed in the plan review process, I think that's a really important piece of this to make sure we get there.
Thanks, Ron. And I want to color that your comment with what we heard earlier in the meeting, that maintaining a prescriptive approach is also going to be needed for many of the jurisdictions across the state, or it sounds like is a desire from some board members. So finding that sweet spot.
Yeah, I mean, it's okay to have prescriptive requirements as long as it's not too complicated and require too much information that's not typically shown on construction drawings. I think that's where we get a little tripped up, is where, you know, minor field changes all of a sudden require full sets of drawings to be revised and recalculated. I think anything along those lines tends to be a bit of a problem, even for, you know, the small affordable homes that we're trying to help. That's, I think, where we see it even more so than big complicated projects that have full design teams behind them.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Ron. Kristen, I just want to make sure your hand is not still up from
Oops, sorry.
Okay, no, just checking. Carolyn.
Yeah, thanks. Following on Ron's point, there were a couple in there that had contract terms. So one was, you know, offsite solar or solar garden subscriptions, and then there was another one, I can't recall what it was now, that was also some form of contract. And I just want to name the complexity of that in terms of code compliance. You know, local jurisdictions can assess compliance at the time of construction and permit closeout, but it's very hard to then tie those contracts to ongoing compliance, right? There's no mechanism unless we, somehow tie it to property records or other things. And so that does represent a definite lift for local jurisdictions that I would tend to recommend we avoid. And then the other one I think I'll just name is I think the added EV spaces and EV requirements are a little bit complex in terms of crediting, and so I'm not particularly enamored with those as strategies, especially given that we've already set base thresholds, and it's very easy for jurisdictions to, like, if they want to encourage more or less. And it's also a little bit harder to say whether that yields the same energy outcomes in terms of equivalencies. And so I think I wouldn't necessarily want to adopt those either.
Thanks, Carolyn. Any other thoughts from board members about elements that to question number 4 may seem overly complicated or not worth approaching? Okay, maybe we've covered them all, which is all right. I think I would like to ask, we focus, I think a lot of the comments I've heard so far are related to residential code, allowing for different certifications to potentially be allowable options for code compliance. We talked about the focus on sort of efficiency, even in an all-electric scenario, recognizing the diverse types of communities across this state. But within that, heard a lot of support around a home size variance or different requirements based on home size. Any approaches that we heard in the commercial building side that we liked or didn't like as a board? I think most of the ones we kind of looked at kind of focused around that electric preferred. It had somewhat of an electric preferred approach, but there were a couple other ones, and I'm happy to scroll back to different code standards if folks want to look at them as they're sharing their comment. But any thoughts from the board on commercial? Yeah, Tim.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad you brought the commercial up. And once the board gets a chance to kind of peruse the final red line draft, but the one I'll point out that was brought forward, I think, in whatever meeting or two ago, was on the commercial side that there is a requirement in the 2024 to provide an all new construction on-site renewable energy, and which will be solar, basically, unless you want to figure out how to do geothermal. That would be fun on infill lots. But anyway, with that being said, so that's right there going to be a huge impact on the commercial side of things from a development standpoint and a cost standpoint. And I'm not sure you need to go much beyond that for an impact on the costs and for development things.
Thanks, Tim. And so I'm reading between the lines of your comment that your current thinking is that that's going to be too onerous of a requirement.
I just want to point out that it's there, and I'm not sure how much more you want to pile on in a way on top of that. I mean, I know that the board's going to be going down the path to take a look at some of the appendices, et cetera. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Clarifying. Kevin.
I'm curious. I think by statute, we're only dealing with operational carbon. Is that correct? Not anything to do with embodied carbon?
That's correct.
Okay, makes sense.
However, I will say that the Energy Office is pursuing other avenues to try to drive at embodied carbon. If you would like to have that conversation, Kevin, we're always happy to talk about it. But for the purposes of this, we're really only talking about operational energy emissions here.
Yep.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. Hope, I was wondering if you wanted to unmute and just share a little bit more context behind your comment. I know that there have been a couple comments floating in the chat. Hopefully you guys have been seeing some around the increased efficiency standards by DOE. But Hope, do you want to just unmute and share a little bit of how that is expected to roll out?
Yeah, DOE has the new efficiency standards as far as how equipment will be tested and what the new minimum standards are. That went into effect as of January 1st of last year. So manufacturers can no longer manufacture the equipment to the old standards, but they are still permitted to sell and install what they already had in stock. There in the map, there's north, there's the south, and then there's the southwest. Colorado is considered the north. And last time I checked, which has been a little while, and I haven't spoken with my people out in DC in the last little while, but the north was the only location that was still permitted to install the older equipment. So that's about all the information I have on that.
Thanks, Hope. And do you know, you just said that was the only information, but I'm going to ask a follow-up question.
Yeah.
Do you know if that is, that permission is like time bound? Or
yeah, I believe
there's
it
typically
is.
a 2-year sell-through period, but I would
Yeah.
encourage us in a future meeting maybe to kind of visit the latest updates in the Federal Appliance Standards Program, because there are, in addition to that, some new updates that went into effect at the end of last year. So it might be good just to have a very brief review, because I think it could render some of these debates in the future a lot easier around what level for furnace efficiency.
Yeah,
Agreed.
awesome. Great. Yeah, thanks, Kristen. Thanks, Hope. That's definitely something we can figure out where to fit into our future schedule. Okay. Well, I'll sort of make a call for any final thoughts around residential, commercial, looking at the code standards we looked at. You all also work across the state in a number of different jurisdictions that have varied codes. So just kind of open the floor if there's any final thoughts, additional codes folks might recommend the board look at, or any final comments from folks. Kevin.
I was just curious, Carolyn, if you could describe the process that you've been through recently with the newly adopted code for Boulder, and if there's any lessons learned from that might be applicable to this group.
Yeah, no, and so we're in the adoption process right now, and of course it's you know, I guess a few things. We definitely strive for increasing flexibility and removing some of this prescriptive nature as much as we could from both residential and commercial, while you know, just being clear around you know, preserving kind of core envelope requirements. So like we have the backstop pre-solar requirements in residential now, or that's what we expect to be adopted, so that we're not just overcompensating with solar. You know, I think that's a key one. We are going forward with the mandatory credits in both residential and commercial. We certainly expanded our list because we can and are looking at things beyond, you know, what I think this code would do with embodied carbon and some other requirements. But I mean, I think there's a lot of elements in the 2024 that are pretty consistent with what we have. You know, to Tim's earlier point, though, I mean, I think as we dive into this discussion, I think we need to take a hard look at some of those, everything to do with solar within the context of this code, just understanding where we are as a state and whether it makes sense to prescribe the solar as the 2024 does. So I do think that's important. And I think, yeah, we did I put it in the chat, but the smaller homes and or ADUs, or we allowed for the prescriptive path. We've been very hesitant to set less stringent requirements for things that fit between there and where we currently are requiring net zero, just because we want to make sure we're still building good, resilient, efficient homes for everybody. So I think those are some of the key things. And then we do have we are anticipating, I can't speak for my council until they adopt it. We are anticipating all electric, with exceptions in the commercial for use types, commercial cooking, laboratories, hospitals, and certain industrial applications. And then we do happen to have, where you're in one of those exception categories, if you're using gas for space and water heating, you have to offset those uses with on-site solar. That's what we're proposing. So those are some of the what I would call the above 2024 things that we're doing in Boulder.
Thanks.
Thanks, Carolyn. Good question, Kevin. I also just wanted to call attention. Adam did answer this question that popped up in the Q&A. The House Bill 24-1352, which, if passed, would have some implications for the board. So feel free to take a look at that comment. And I think we'll plan to do at our next meeting, May 14th, we'll have that. The legislative session will be done. And so we can plan to give the board a full legislative update on all pieces that will concern the board or impact this process. Okay. Any other final thoughts or questions? All right. Well, oh yeah, Cody.
Yeah, I just have a question on the 2024 draft that you guys are going to send us. What format is it in? Is it indexed, or are we just getting a big PDF with a bunch of red lines that we'll have to format ourselves?
I'm sorry to say that it is a big PDF. It is redlined with blue text, so it's a little easier to less aggressive on the eyes. I guess that's the only benefit. It's a very long PDF, and I do think it will take some like self bookmarking as you work through it.
It doesn't have any indexing in there.
It has great bookmarks in it, Cody.
Does it?
It does. Cool.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I opened it in Bluebeam, and the bookmarks are all working great for me.
Perfect. That's all I want to know. Thank you.
Sure.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks, Cody. All right. Cool. Well, with that, if questions come up as I give my final spiel today, raise your hand and interrupt me because we have to have a few more minutes. But just as a reminder and wrap up of next steps. So our next meeting is Tuesday, May 14th from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Again, we will be sending the code to you all today, and we request that you all take time to look through it, read sections that you are passionate about or want to see where they landed, and come prepared to that meeting with questions that you might have. Recognize we have a second study session about a month later, so if you don't get through the whole code, don't panic. We'll have another time for you guys to get together and ask questions. And then at any time, as you guys have questions, I just offer to make sure you're sending those to Adam and I, and we can get them sent to Hope and Anna and help coordinate those responses. Also on Tuesday, May 14th is our public webinar. So your attendance, as I know some of you are not able to attend, and that is okay. But if you're able to, attendance is highly encouraged. Please help us share the word about the webinar. We'll get you those outreach materials as soon as we can. This week, I think the final thing we need is to create the webinar link. So once we have all of those pieces finalized, you will have the outreach toolkit immediately. And then we'll also clean up and finalize our meeting notes from this meeting and send those out for approval at the start of our next meeting. Other things we flagged today that I just want to mention: at our next meeting, we'll try to give that legislative update on where the timeline extension legislation for this board process landed, as well as that House bill that was mentioned in the Q&A. And with that, I think that's everything I've got. Adam, any final thoughts before we wrap up today?
I don't think so. Just thank you all for the robust discussion. I'm excited to dive into some of these things more deeply, but I think that's all I have.
Awesome. Yeah, Tim, final thoughts, questions?
Yeah, Adam, on a closing note, can you send everybody a picture or a YouTube video of you on the surfboard?
I will not be doing that because I have no desire to be on a surfboard. But I'm more than happy to send everybody a video of some waves on a beach if you'd like that.
Oh, that's a good question, Tim. Elizabeth?
Yeah, just a quick question. I thought this is all really helpful. Will these slides be available PDF? And I may have missed that, sorry.
Yes, we'll send these slides out with the meeting notes, and we'll make sure that all of those links, all of the links carry through to the PDF, so you guys can check
Super,
out.
thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. All right, well, happy Tuesday, everybody. Great to see you guys, and we'll see you all in a couple weeks, and you'll hear from us via email. So take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.